Alright, let's go over Tyth real quick. These slides will have some of the basic mechanics and pretty much everything you need to know to clear the first boss. It doesn't go too in depth with everything that you might need or every single optimization you might want to make, but it will have the main points. So here's some of the lists of what we're going to be going over. We'll talk about the general mechanics, such as the Magma Droids inversion, energizing overload, boss cleave, stacks of rage. Stacks of rage being probably the most complicated and most important, as well as talking about some of the individual roles of the bosses. Tyth, like many of the bosses in Gods, actually has split up roles for the DPS. So we'll talk about the primary grace, secondary grace, the AoE DPS, and then the more free DPS, who is primarily responsible for damaging the boss as well as assisting the other players in their roles. So first off, as soon as you pull the boss, you're going to have to deal with the Magma Droids, 2 adds that spawn on either side of Tyth. The tanks will pull them into Tyth, into melee range. They'll automatically walk into melee range. You can force pull or grapple one and taunt the other, and you'll be pretty safe to do that. Usually this is the tank who's holding Tyth, but the off tank can do it as well. It doesn't matter too much, really. You just want to be careful because they're susceptible to CC. So if you do something like a oil slick on the edge of the ring or something, and the Magma Droid tries to walk in, he'll be slowed by it. We'll have a hard time coming in. If you hit it with like a Madness Root, if you're trying to like pre-dot them before they come in, that would be pretty embarrassing to have it just sitting out there with your dot on it, because everybody knows you made a mistake there. They'll do some telegraphed AoEs on the ground, the magma pools, which deal elemental damage. So since it's elemental, obviously it can't be shielded or resisted or really diminished by a lot of things. So you definitely don't want to be in it. AoE DR will still work, and that's usually a good idea to pop off early rounds here, since you won't be needing it most likely for anything else. So this is a good time to fuel for both the tank and for the DPS, but we're talking about the DPS mainly here. As well as pop any raid buffs once the Magma Droids are in, because you want to kill them quickly before the inversion, which is a general mechanic we'll talk about right here. So as you see on the bottom left, Tyth will do a large blue circle around him. This is referred to as the inversion, and after a short channel, it will toss all of the players across the map. The further you are from Tyth, the shorter the fling. So you can see the players standing on the edge of the circle don't want to be flinged very far, whereas some towards the closer to Tyth will want to be flinged a little further, perhaps because they have an ad they need to reach or whatever reason, and we'll get into depth on every little part of that. But typically, the closer you are to Tyth, the more dangerous the fling, because you're more susceptible to being tossed completely off of the platform and looking like a fool, which happens to me quite frequently. So the DPS want to obtain this shortwave inversion buff, this green one at the top here, the inversion resonance shortwave. It just means that you are inside of the circle, not outside of the circle. It increases your damage received, which is obviously a negative thing, but it also increases your healing received by 100%, which is really great because, after each phase, you can then be almost instantly healed right back up. The healer's job on Tyth is pretty easy, honestly. You're dealing with mostly just the inversion and healing players, and since there's a massive healing buff that's gained and the damage isn't too crazy, you're pretty much safe for most of it. There's a cleanse that we'll talk about way later on, but for the most part, that's it. The long wave inversion is a buff that's given to anybody who's standing outside of the circle. The tank really wants to collect this. One of the tanks do. Whichever one is not holding the boss at that time wants to collect the long wave inversion buff. The tank who's managing the ads will want that. If you're a DPS, gaining the long wave inversion buff is preferable to dying, of course, if you can't make it inside of the circle. However, you'll have to be prepared to drop threat, as you'll be competing with the tank for aggro. If no players are standing outside when the inversion cast concludes, the boss will begin to one-shot each member of the team with a cast called Resonant Implosion, which is something we seriously want to avoid, but the tank will always be the one responsible for standing out, so as a DPS, you typically don't have to worry about that very often. It's important to note, if you're tanking, and this is just a note for the tanks, that the inversion will destroy all the threat that you've generated against Tyth. So if you're doing a tank swap, which you'll have to do on pretty much every inversion, You're going to want to taunt during the inversion cast while the blue circle's on the ground, as opposed to after. If you taunt after the cast, you'll be taunting off of 0 threat, and as we know, a taunt takes the current amount of threat that you have on the boss, adds about 15% to it, and sets it as 0 threat. So if you're taking 0, adding 15% is 0, and setting it to your threat, you're having 0, you're wasting your taunt, you look a fool, it hits the DPS, everybody's confused, it's bedtime, so we'll avoid that. Okay, talking about another general mechanic, we'll talk about energizing overload. This is a more niche mechanic. A lot of players don't actually even know this exists, and you might even clear Tyth without knowing that this exists. We'll talk more about it when we talk specifically about justices. But when a justice gets shot with a lance beam, and if those words make no sense to you, that's okay, we'll talk about it in depth. It will produce a buff on nearby allies called energizing overload, which increases your damage done by 20%. So as you can see on the bottom left, you have a lance aiming at a justice, which is about to break its shield. And then on the right side, you'll see a small golden ring around the justice. This indicates the area for which the buff will be applied. If none of this makes any sense, that's okay. Bear with me. We'll go over everything. This is just a small general mechanic. The buff lasts for about 10 seconds. So we'll talk about the bread and butter about the Tyth fight, which is the fact that at 10 stacks of rage, he likes to blow up and wipe most teams. It's almost 100% a wipe in a prog team or unskilled groups, but manipulation of the stacks with rage decay, this white buff here, is kind of like the primary goal of this fight. So Tyth has a stacking buff on him, which is his rage stacks, which increase or decrease based on various mechanics that we'll go over further into the slideshow. But every 8 seconds, a stack will fall off of the boss. Cleaving and add will add 3 stacks to his rage. If the boss hits 10 stacks, he'll blow up. Not great. If the boss receives a heal, it'll subtract 1 stack. Killing an add with standard means, such as like a DPS killing it, will increase it by 1 stack. Contrary to some people's belief, killing a healer does not grant more than 1 stack. It's still just 1 stack if it's killed by DPS. And the magma droids don't add any stacks. So feel free to pause and read any of the information on the screen. I'll be kind of sharing different information through voice, some of the things that aren't showed on the slide. As you can see, we have a picture of myself cleaving a guardian and adding 3 stacks to the boss. This is inadvertent and generally very, very negative. It's recoverable, but it's not ideal. We'll go into some of the DPS jobs. Starting here with the primary and secondary grace. Those are 2 separate jobs, but they are very similar. There's a PT or Mara is nice for this, but any class with shorter interrupts reduce the room for error. It can be done with any class though. Primary grace will have the grace that's nearest to the boss. So whichever one is closer to the boss, then that's the one the primary will be responsible for handling. This will happen in very, very many waves. The secondary grace handler will only happen in waves of 8 where 2 graces spawn, or in some case where a grace is left alive or something, then you may both be working, but that's unlikely. You use your interrupts and stuns and stun grenades to prevent heals from going out. You should only need to stop the cast twice if you do it late in the cast, because then it will cast the shield afterwards, which is usually what you're aiming for. The primary grace will almost always let a shield go out. Secondary grace sometimes will, sometimes won't, depending on the wave, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So we talked briefly about the 2 casts that the grace performs, which is Avela's Grace and Avela's Restoration. Avela's Restoration is the heal, which will heal the boss around 4 to 5% of its max health, which is a huge pain in the ass. You almost never want to have a heal go out. It will reduce the rage stacks on the boss by like 1, but it will. It's not ideal in most situations. The only really situation where you use it is if you want to delay going into burn, like if you have a lot of adds alive or your rage stacks are really too high to go right now and you need to decay a little bit, then you can let Vela's Restoration go out. Otherwise, you're pretty much going to be interrupting it with your stuns, interrupts, leaps, whatever you need to do. Keep in mind that your interrupt will prevent the cast from being recast for 4 seconds, as well as the stun will prevent it from obviously casting during the period of time that it is incapacitated. Avela's Grace is the shield. It will reduce the damage done to Tyth by 75%. If more than one shield is cast on the boss, it increases the time, and it lasts for about 12 seconds. I think it's 18 if 2 go out, but I'm not 100% on that one. So here is what it looks like when the shield is being cast. It's like an electrical connection between the Grace and the boss. Again, it removes 3 stacks of rage and decreases the boss's damage taken by 75% for a few seconds. Here's what a heal looks like. Again, that removes 1 stack of rage and adds about 4% back to the boss, which can be a devastating amount, definitely. So we'll go a little more in depth with Energizing Overload real quick. So you obtain Energizing Overload buff by being near the Justice when shot with a lance. You use it as a DPS bonus to cleave down the adds. This mostly pertains to the boss DPS, who's mostly hitting the boss, the AoE DPS, who's mostly responsible for the adds, and the secondary Grace Manager, who is not always going to have a Grace and will fill into the other 2 roles when they're not dealing with the Grace. So most classes can do the job of the AoE DPS. Some people like to run Cut to Pieces Jug, other people will run Madness, but you can run it on a Pyro PT, or really anything is very viable. I've even seen it done on Lightning or Madness, although I wouldn't, opt to do those first line personally. But as long as your teammates know what's going on and they help you out with it, you can pretty much do it on anything. You could even do it without an AoE tactical if you want to. The idea is that you want them all to die very quickly, like in quick succession of each other. That way you don't reset the rage timer too frequently, because as we talked about, the rage decay timer will reset every time he gains rage, and obviously he'll gain rage when an ad dies. So if we have all the ads dying at the same time, we'll get more rage decays going out, and it will be all around much smoother. The rage will obviously increase the damage that Tyth does, and we'll go on to that more in the tanking portion of the guide. So moving forward, we'll do a quick review over all of the different ads. The Guardians, Justice, Lances, and Graces. If they're alive for 64 seconds, they charge up and they become significantly stronger, but we'll talk about each one of them. Guardians are very simple. They follow around their target in melee range and use a white damage basic attack, so melee range. When they die, they do damage to all the other units on the platform, including other ads. Justices deal stacking damage to anybody inside of their blue shield. Damage done from outside of the shield is reflected to the user. You bring the shield down by getting aggro of a lance and aiming it at the Justice. This is a tank's job. Lances will periodically fire a beam at their target, which will bring the shield down. Graces have been covered in the other slide, so I won't talk too much about that. Like I said, all of the ads enrage if they're not killed in 64 seconds or less than. Justices, when they're enraged, will sprint towards their targets, placing you under their shield and dealing stacking damage. Lance's beams will become much more determined to hit you. The Guardians will gain speed and damage, and the Graces will heal all the other droids, and the channel time on their heal will be nearly instant. We don't see this very often, it's very rarely seen, but it's pretty amusing as it can heal Tyth back up to 100% HP relatively fast, so you probably won't ever see that. Hopefully you won't ever see that. We'll talk about the tank's job now. Like many of the bosses, tanking is perceived as the hardest job on Tyth. The tank who's not holding the boss handles the ads, and we'll review this first. Colors correspond to the ad type spawning. Twice there will be a wave where 8 ads spawn, otherwise there will be 4. The goal is to group the Guardians on the Justice while using the Lance to break the Justice shield. Doing this timely results in an easy job for DPS and a smooth transition. In most cases, ads will want to be killed before going on to the next phase. The exception is leaving a Lance alive that will handle the next wave in the event that the Justices spawn without a Lance available. The first wave will be 8 ads, and the second wave the first wave of 8 the first wave will be 8 ads, and the first wave spawned below, when Tyth is below 60%, will also be 8 ads, which is commonly referred to as the wave of 8. Sorry. Using rooting and stunning spells such as overload bindings and carb is a common practice when the inversion starts, and you do not anticipate that the Guardians or other ads will be killed in time, which happens frequently on the second wave of 8. 2 debuffs to go over quickly that apply only to tanks. You'll receive the Meltdown debuff as well as the Armor Melt debuff based on Tyth's attacks. So the basic attacks from Tyth will add the cleansable debuff called Armor Melt, which reduces armor by 10%. Healers will alternate cleansing the buff. Armor Melt will still apply if the basic attack is defended, of course. The Conal Sweep attack will provide the Meltdown debuff, which reduces your healing received. The Shortwave Inversion, which happens on each tank swap, will remove Meltdown. Energy Wave knocks you straight back from Tyth, threatening to send you off of the platform, and we'll talk more about that right here. So the tank not holding the ads will of course have to hold Tyth. Basic attacks from Tyth add a cleansing debuff called Armor Melt, which reduces the armor by 10%. Healers will alternate cleansing the buff. Armor Melt will still be applied if the basic attack is defended. The Conal attack will provide the Meltdown debuff, which reduces your healing received. Shortwave Inversion will remove Meltdown. Energy Wave knocks you back from Tyth, threatening to send you off the platform. Barring any exceptions, Tyth will commonly use Energy Wave, Sweep, Energy Wave, Sweep, Sweep, Energy Wave as his pattern for attacks. Rage stacks increase the damage of all stacks, and the distance knocked by Energy Wave, and the conal degree of the sweep. Tanks are expected to have defensive cooldowns running for the majority of the time they're holding Tyth, with an emphasis on high rage Energy Waves. The sweeps are melee attacks which respond well to cooldowns like Fuel, Oil Slick, Saber Ward, and Inflection. Energy Wave is a tech attack that responds well to Shroud, Emergency Power, and Invincible. Going into Burn, starts at 25% health remaining. Tyth instantly gains 2 stacks and generates another 2 stacks every few seconds. DPS will all focus Tyth in an attempt to finish him before he hits Rage Overload. You'll want to enter this phase, which is few stacks as possible. The ads are now ignored by DPS completely. If a Gray spawns, it should be killed quickly by DPS or interrupted by tanks and healers. A heal performed by Grace is a common way to lose it all in this phase. On Inversion, the tank with the ads should use a Binding or AoE ability to facilitate a clean swap. The Toss tank should pick up the ads with AoE taunt just as before. Well, in this slideshow, we provided all the information needed for a first kill. Healers have simple time on this boss. Like I said before, there's not many specific mechanics that apply directly to healers that they need to take care of on this boss. Just doing the inversions properly and getting a few cleanses will really get you through it. Healing is steroided every time you go through an inversion, and you can heal people up back to 100% and then go back to DPSing the boss. You can also help make the boss flow smoothly by including your own AoE spells when the Justice is beamed. If you manage to kill Tyth, congratulations. It's your first step into a bigger world of raiding.